5 seconds ahead of time. We will get going with the 137th Reading Online Sports Economics Seminar. One of our most frequent presenters, we're very pleased to say, has been Stefan Szymanski over the years at the University of Michigan, presenting many fascinating papers over the time that we've been running these seminars. Before I hand over to Stefan, just to say that if you do want to present, there are slots between now and Christmas. If you want to present a paper, so long as I've always said, so long as there's demand and supply for these seminars, I'm quite happy to be the market maker, so to speak, and bring folk together. So if you do have a paper you want to present in the usual standard format, let me know. We've got dates in November and December in the run-up to Christmas. Stefan is going to present a paper on capital scale complementarity and new stadiums. Stefan, all yours.
Thanks, James, and pleasure to be here. Thank you very much. Good morning to everyone. Just struggling to share my window as always. There.
Yep, you managed it. Yep.
I've managed it?
Yep.
Okay. So, yes, thank you everyone for coming along. And I should probably start by saying that please be nice about that paper. Silke will thank you because I've been obsessing about this for so long. She's really sick of this paper and would like it to be finished and done. So it has become a little bit of an obsession for me, the impact of new stadiums. And as you might know, or you probably don't know, but I think it's a couple of years now since I presented a paper on new stadiums on English soccer, and this really is a reworking of that and an updating of that, and really trying to, in some ways, in a response to the reception that I thought that paper got last time. So here's another try. So let me just explain the basic idea in a nutshell. So capital and skill may well be complementary investments, complementary inputs. So capital here in this case is going to be new stadiums, and skill here is team quality. However, the research from North America suggests, by and large, that this isn't the case. There's no evidence in support of this. That in particular, new stadiums do not appear to be associated with an improvement in team quality, and that is inconsistent with the capital skill complementarity hypothesis. What I'm going to suggest is that the reason for this is actually the institutional structure of North American professional sports leagues, which do not have promotion and relegation. Promotion and relegation creates a situation where there are significantly potentially large marginal returns to team quality improvement. And the evidence I'm going to show you is consistent with that observation and with the capital skill complementarity. I'm going to start off by, or let me say, in my outline, I'm going to start off by explaining in more detail the capital skill complementarity, think about how it applies to new stadiums, review the evidence from North America, and then I'm going to go into the English data and look at the structure, the promotion relegation system, the labor market, and the impact of new stadiums. I'm going to talk about the identification issue, estimation, and show you some econometric results. Although in some ways, maybe oddly, the econometrics in this is not necessarily the most important part. So let's start off with the capital skill complementarity. I expect many of you know what this is and are familiar with it, but just in case, let me talk you through a little bit. So here's a quote from a paper.
Stefan,
yeah.
Stefan, it seems that your screen's frozen. At least I can still only see your first, your title slide.
Oh, so I'm moving
window.
my slide. That's not changing anything when so I'm changing the
slides.
No,
we're still on your title slide.
Oh no. What about but I am sharing my screen.
It might be that you shared window where the presentation was rather than your PowerPoint.
Okay, so do I click on the share button, right?
Yeah, click on the share and then.
And so share screen, window, or tab, right?
I mean, if you just share your entire screen, then we'll have exactly what you're seeing, or you can pick one of the windows, a bit like you do in Zoom.
Ah, okay. So now, can you see that?
Can you still see the title slide? What should
Now,
we?
if I go down, hang on, did that change?
Yep. Now we've got the idea in a nutshell.
Oh, I'm sorry.
That's okay.
Okay. So I said this in a nutshell. This is what the paper's about: the idea of capital skill complementarity. That's a rough outline of my paper, but this was where I got to. So, what is the capital skill complementarity? So this is this nice quote from a paper, which I think sums it up very quickly, very easily. If the stock of equipment increases, then so does the stock of skilled labor. So this idea of capital skill complementarity really has emerged as a result of observations about changes in the labor market in North America and around the world, really since World War II, where the supply of skilled labor has increased dramatically. But at the same time, the wages of skilled labor have also risen dramatically. And that's the kind of economic phenomenon that needs explaining, both the simultaneous increase in supply and increase in wage premium. Sometimes generically referred to as the concept of skill-biased technical change. It seems like technology has enhanced the demand for skilled labor, even as that supply of skilled labor has increased dramatically. So the capital skill complementarity hypothesis is really about trying to explain that in terms of a production function. And this is a quote from probably the main paper published in this area by oops. Sorry, that's the cat. Okay, so this quote here is from Crucell et al. 2000, in Econometrica, and the actual hypothesis, the capital skill complementarity hypothesis, goes back to Grillikes in 1969. He wrote a very short article explaining why this might exist, and the technical example here is very straightforward. Basically, the idea is that if you have a CES production function and the elasticity of substitution between skilled labor and capital is less than the elasticity of substitution between unskilled labor and capital, you will get the phenomenon that increases in capital will raise the marginal product of skilled labor relative to the marginal product of unskilled labor. And hence, you can see at the same time an increase in the wage premium, even as the supply of skilled labor increases. So that's the basic idea. And the authors of the 2000 paper sort of recently revisited this and showed that, if anything, since their 2000 paper, this phenomenon has become clearer and clearer. So you can see here in the top two panels the supply of skilled labor and unskilled labor over time, and skilled labor increasing dramatically and unskilled labor after some recovery in the 90s decreasing again. And but the wage bill ratio, which is the ratio of skilled labor wages to total wages, has been rising significantly, and in the bottom right-hand panel, the skill premium has been increasing significantly. So, and the empirical evidence seems to fit pretty closely with the capital skill complementarity hypothesis. So, this seems to be a hypothesis that is well supported in the data, as well as, I think, being reasonably intuitive, actually. So if we're going to apply this to stadiums, then we should imagine that stadiums are capital and the playing talent is the skilled labor. And these are the two principal inputs, after all, in professional team sports. And so capital skill complementarity should imply that there will be an increase in the marginal product of players as a result of building a new stadium. The higher marginal productivity implies that a profit maximizing firm should invest more in skilled players. And if you invest more in skilled players, we should expect in general that team performance will improve. So let's think about an example of this mechanism. And so here's an example of a touchdown pass in football. So the idea is that the marginal product of this skill is being increased by the new stadium. So how would that work in practice? Well, one thing would be just simple ideas, better sight lines. You can see the play better, and therefore seeing the play better makes it more valuable. It's more, the marginal product is actually enhanced by being better able to appreciate it. The video replay boards enhance the ability to appreciate the skill player and therefore raises the marginal product. Things like wireless communication within the stadiums enables people to enjoy the evidence and to perhaps share their experience with others, which again raises the return to this performance, to the skill performance of the player. And just in general, better amenities can increase the quality or the ability to appreciate the play. So if you're not spending 20 minutes lining up to go to the restroom, then that's actually can enhance the productivity of the play on the field because you have more opportunities to enjoy it. So there are various mechanisms here through which a new stadium could plausibly improve the marginal product of the players. And there are actually some studies about this. So there are several studies that find that not new stadiums specifically, but better amenities at stadiums enhance the enjoyment of the fans and the appreciation of the fans, and therefore enhances their willingness both to stay at a game and watch it to the end, and also to return and come and watch another game. So there's some general papers that have been written on this, but a couple of more recent ones that Cho et al. And Li et al. Say that these amenities can have more impact on loyal fans, so that the committed fans can enjoy the game more, and therefore they're more likely to return. And also that the stadium amenities can increase the likelihood of fans be starting to identify with the team, and so that identification is going to enhance the demand for the team performance and therefore potentially the skill performance of the players. However, if we look at the empirical literature on new stadiums in the context of North America, we have two very clear results. So the first, both of these seem pretty well established. The first one, which is not the subject of this presentation, is just the honeymoon effect, the novelty effect, which shows that there's a jump in attendance when you build a new stadium. And I published a paper in Economic Inquiry this year about Major League Baseball and the honeymoon effect, which in that you can see a review of the literature. There's a not insignificant literature on this, and my paper really just confirms really what we found, what was found in the previous literature. And JC also has a discussion paper out this year, which also surveys the literature and looks across not just baseball, but looks across all the 4 major league sports. And again, this honeymoon novelty effect seems pretty well established. We can argue about the length and the exact extent of the effect. It doesn't last forever. How long it lasts varies a little bit amongst the and how big it is varies a little bit amongst the research. But this effect is pretty much I would have thought probably one of the better established empirical regularities in sports economics. However, at the same time, there's very little evidence that team performance improves, which suggests that there actually is no evidence of complementarity. So I've listed here these studies. Many of these studies were also on the novelty effect itself, but you can see that basically people have looked at wins, win percentage, home win percentage across a variety of professional leagues, also looked at college baseball, and almost uniformly find no significant improvement. There's one, Quinn et al. In 2003 finds some improvement in teams in Major League Baseball, as do Watson and Krantz in 2003. So there's a little bit of evidence there, but by and large, there's not really any strong support for the idea of capital skill complementarity. which I would suggest on the face of it is something of a puzzle. Why should this be? And there are essentially, in the literature, we see sort of two explanations advanced for this phenomenon. So the first is that fans only care about, they either care about one thing or the other. They're bipolar. So they either care about the quality of the game, or the quality, which means the quality of the teams, or they care about the amenities. And there's no interaction between those two concerns. So when you build a new stadium, you might attract more fans through the honeymoon effect. You'll get more fans because of the better amenities, but they don't care about the team performance. So there's not going to be any kind of knock-on effect into increasing the marginal product of the players. A more complex argument is in a very interesting paper recently from Easton and Rockaby, suggests that it may well be that they are complementary. They develop a theoretical model to explain this, but that the restrictions in the labor market, and the scarcity of talent implies that it's actually not profitable to improve team quality. And that seems to me to be, I'm much more inclined towards this second explanation, since I find the first explanation implausible. I can imagine that some fans only care about on-field performance, and I can imagine some fans only care about amenities. But it also seems to me implausible that there aren't a lot of fans who care about both, and that there is an interaction effect. It seems really, this bipolar hypothesis seems really extreme to me. And it seems to be much more likely, since we know that there are labor market restrictions in North America that are very significant, it seems quite much more plausible that there's a marginal productivity effect, but that it's swamped by the labor market restraints and limits, which make it unprofitable to invest in team quality. However, I think it's also probably true to say that it's not that easy to disentangle these two effects. It's not clear that how we would identify clearly which effect is at work. And I suppose it's conceivable that there are other explanations as well. So I think this remains a puzzle in the North American literature. So now with that background, now I want to turn to the English case and really look at the same question, but just now in a different context. So do we see evidence that new stadiums increase the marginal product of skilled players, leading to better teams and better results in English soccer? So first, let's the central feature in my view, which distinguishes North American sports from not just English soccer, but soccer in pretty much everywhere else in the world, is the institution of promotion and relegation. So I'm not going to explain to this crowd what promotion and relegation is. Of course, you know what that is, and you're all familiar with it. But I do want to draw your attention to a quote from Roger Knowles' famous paper that he published in 2002 on the issue of promotion and relegation, which still remains probably the best introduction to an American audience to what promotion and relegation is. He said, promotion increases the marginal revenue product of quality and so causes the team to spend more on players if it joins a higher league. So there's a marginal productivity effect associated with promotion. And that's going to interact with the new stadium effect in my story. So let's say a little bit about this. Again, sometimes the discussion on promotion and relegation can get very heated without a lot of light being generated. So I just want to draw attention to some key pertinent facts about this. So firstly, it's a very common thing. There's a lot of promotion and relegation. It's not a marginal thing that affects just a few clubs now and again. So in the data period I'm looking at between 1986 and 2019, I've got 3,036 team seasons, so 3,036 observations. Within that, there are 751 promotions or relegations. So that's nearly a quarter of, so in nearly a quarter of team seasons, the team has been promoted or relegated that season. And this affects pretty much everybody. So, and it affects them on a regular basis. So the median number of seasons per promotion and relegation is 3.7. So effectively, less than once every 4 years, a median team is going to experience a move up or down. So it's happening a lot. And frankly, it's happening soon, right? It's not that far on the horizon. Right? And of the 112 clubs, so I'm looking at the top 4 English divisions, 4 tiers, and of the 112 clubs that appear in my data set over that period, there are only 5 who have never experienced promotion relegation in that period, or who never experienced it in that period. They are all Premier League teams. You can probably name them. One of them, Everton, I don't know if we've got any Everton fans noted, but Everton have been flirting with relegation continuously for the last decade. And it's quite amazing that they haven't been relegated. And surely within the next decade, they're going to get relegated because they just keep getting so close. It could easily have been 4 within this period. So, but again, my point is this affects pretty much everybody. It's not a marginal phenomenon affecting only a few clubs. Every club is involved in this, and clubs regularly move up and down. It's a constant process. The other thing to say is that teams in higher tiers, teams in higher levels, are better, significantly better than teams in lower tiers. And so we can identify this because they play each other. Because as well as league play, there are cup competitions. These are elimination tournaments, the FA Cup, the League Cup, which take place annually, where there is a random draw for each round, and randomly teams from different tiers get to play against each other. And so we can compile the results of teams when they play in higher tiers playing against teams in lower tiers. And you can see here the win percentages are overwhelmingly in favor of the teams in the higher tiers. Of course, there are no ties in these tournaments because they're elimination tournaments. So we know who goes through. We don't have that usual problem of draws in soccer. And so you can see here that when comparing, and I compare in the 2 panels from the 85-86 season and the 2018-19 season at the beginning and end of my data. And you can see here that this is overwhelmingly dominant performance of teams in higher tiers against teams in lower tiers. They're better teams. There are a couple of anomalies there. Basically, they are because in some of these cells there are only 1 or 2 observations. So you do get upsets. You do get, David sometimes beats Goliath, but overwhelmingly Goliath crushes David in these contexts. And because they're better, they attract much higher audiences in the higher tiers. So you can see here again the difference in the attendance in different tiers are in 4 different seasons in my data. And you can, although there's some movement in the level of attendance over these periods, essentially you have almost a 2-to-1 ratio comparing one division to the next division down. Sometimes more than 2-to-1. And so they attract, not surprisingly, they attract bigger audiences. And bear in mind, because promotion and relegation is such a common phenomenon, frequently we're talking about the same team playing in a lower tier. And when it's playing in a lower tier, it's going to attract a much smaller audience. Partly because what attracts people to the game is not just the home team, but the visiting team. And when you get to promoted, you get to play against better visiting teams, and that increases the audience. So if we turn a minute to the labour market, there are, again, most people are going to be familiar with this. There are relatively few restrictions in the labour market, not none, but compared to North America, they are significantly less binding. There are no salary caps explicitly. There are some limits on spending, or have been in some seasons. Go back across my entire data set, wasn't true at the early parts, but there have been in the last decade or so some restraints introduced. But there's no explicit salary cap. There's limited restraints on squad size and expenditures, and there's limited revenue sharing. Again, not that there's none, but it's much less significant than it is in and we see large differences in labour force quality across the tiers, not surprising with the differences in the results that we see. And one way to see that is in the wages, the ratio. So here the figures in this table are in bold are the spending in a particular tier relative to the average across all 4 tiers. So in the tier 1, which is now the Premier League, the ratio has risen from twice the average to now more than 2.5 times the average. The ratio in the bottom tier has fallen from about half the average to actually 10% of the average. So we've seen big growth in gaps in spending between the divisions, but throughout the entire period, we've seen these big differences between spending levels in the different tiers. And promotion and relegation involves significant labor turnover. So when you are promoted or relegated, you change your team quite significantly. So here's an example from this season. Sheffield United have just been promoted to the English Premier League. And what I've listed here from Transfermarkt are the exits and the hires. So 10 players left and 16 new players were hired for the team for the current season. So moving from a lower tier to a higher tier causes a significant amount of labor turnover. And this is something, particularly, again, this has been a bit of a running debate with American economists are thinking about this, or thinking about why promotion and relegation could work or wouldn't work. And one of the key issues you always have to bear in mind is that there has to be significant labor turnover for this system to work. You can't play in the Premier League with a championship team, or if you do, you're going to find yourself you're going to struggle very, very badly. And so you see, and this is true kind of moving generally between the tiers, you see significant labor turnover. And so the labor market has to be relatively liberal in order to enable these changes in the composition of the teams to occur, so that teams can adapt to playing at different levels via promotion and relegation. So new stadiums. So this, I think, is a very nice chart, which the blue line is the average attendance across the 4 tiers of English soccer from 1960 to 2019, so over a 60-year period. And basically, the story is pretty clearly one of decline from 1960 up until 1986, and then one of solid increase since 1986. And to the point where actually in 2019, we got back to where we were back in 1960. And there's a big literature, sociological literature, history written about the causes and consequences of all of this. Basically, English soccer was struggling and failing up until the mid-1980s, and then it enjoys this enormous recovery, which has catapulted the Premier League to being nowadays really the preeminent global league. It was nothing like that in 1986, for sure. And the health of English soccer in general has improved significantly. And what you can see here is that the recovery is associated with a lot of new stadium building. So sometimes people are perhaps a little bit surprised at the extent to which new stadiums have been built in English soccer. It's not something that people talk about a lot, but in fact, between 1986 and 2019, there were 32 new stadiums built. That's, remember, out of the 112 teams that were participating. And when I say 32 built, I mean 32 built by teams that were actually participating in the top 4 divisions at the time the stadium was opened. There are, in fact, half a dozen teams, like Wycombe Wanderers, as an example, of a team that built a new stadium when it was actually playing below the 4th tier, and then got promoted and played in the 4th tier for a while. And there are a few others like that. Forest Green Rovers, I think, is one. So there's a few teams like that. Plus, actually, there are some teams which are still building new stadiums, which are not in the data. So since 2019, we've had a handful of others come in. AFC Wimbledon returned to Plough Lane with a new stadium, and Tottenham, actually, they started playing in their new stadium in on the last 6 games of the 2018-19 season. So I've excluded them as a new stadium from the data because really those 6 games really going to help us here. So, but it's a phenomenon that is continuing, and no doubt we will see more new stadiums. The other thing that I think might be surprising and counterintuitive to many people is that most of these new stadiums are being built in the lower tiers, not in the top tiers. So of my 32 new stadiums, 7 were built by clubs. So let me be clear on this, because of promotion relegation, you have to be, it's a little bit tricky. These are the tier that the club was playing in the season in which the stadium was opened. So they could have been playing in a higher or a lower tier in the previous seasons. But there are 7 clubs who were playing in the Premier League when their stadium opened, 7 playing in the Championship, but 8 in the 3rd tier League One and 10 in the 4th tier League Two. So more than half of the stadiums that more than half of the teams that opened in new stadiums were playing in the lower 2 tiers. And what I want to draw your attention to with this table, which is a bit busy, I know, but this is really the average. Look at the attendance, the average attendance in the season before the new stadium opened, and the capacity of that stadium, and then the capacity of the new stadium that they built. So you can see, look at in the top tier, you have an average attendance of just under 26,000 in the top tier in the season before the new stadium opened. And the average capacity of the old stadium was about 27,000. So basically, these teams were playing at capacity. And one reason for being a new stadium was simply to increase capacity because there was excess demand. And you can see the average capacity jumps quite significantly by over 50%. But if you look at the second tier, they're playing an average attendance of 13,000, and they have a capacity of 20,000. So they're playing well below their capacity, and yet they still build a stadium which is almost 50% bigger. And then when you look at the 3rd and 4th tier, it's really, really striking, I think. In the 3rd and 4th tier, they're having attendances around 5,000 a game, and they're playing in stadiums whose capacity is about 12,000. So they're playing with about 1/3 capacity. And yet look at the size of the new stadiums that they build. They increase their capacity with the building of a new stadium, which I think tells you something about their intentions. They are not intending to continue to play in the 3rd and 4th tiers when they build the new stadium. It simply would make no sense. You'd build a much smaller stadium if that was your plan. And so one thing I would suggest this data reveals is that the teams building new stadiums are frequently intending to be promoted as part of their strategy of building a new stadium.
I have a real quick question.
Yeah.
Are they paid for with private funds or public funds over in England?
Oh, yes, that is in the paper actually. So I should I've meant to circulate the paper in advance. So so majority are actually privately funded. So there is some public funding. So probably about 1/3 of them receive some public funding, or were wholly publicly funded, but well, maybe less than that, maybe 1/4, but most of them are privately funded.
Thanks.
On a related question, these are all privately owned by the clubs, right? It's not owned by the municipality or something like that.
Yeah, no, these are all privately owned.
Thank you.
So I would argue not only did they build with the new stadium with the intention of being promoted, but actually on average they were. So here are two panels really looking at balance samples to show the impact of the change in the level of play of the team first 10 seasons before and after, and second 15 seasons before and after. Because of attrition, we get fewer clubs. We can have 30 clubs before and after for 10 seasons, but only 25 clubs before and after for 15 seasons. Some of them are more recently built. And this is the tiers in which they play. The club season tiers are played from 1 down to 5 or lower. So we have 300 before and after for the 30 clubs for the 10 seasons, and 375 before and after for the 25 clubs and 15. And what the thing to look at is on the right-hand side, what I've highlighted in red. 10 seasons before and after. Before, 42% of those seasons are in the tiers 1 or 2, and after, 54% are in tiers 1 or 2. So there is significant movement upward of these teams. And you can also see that there's no kind of significant movement downward there if you look at the 5 or lower. So in that, and that's a t-test for equality of proportions. It's strongly significant. And then the second one, the 15 seasons before and after, again, 46% in the top 2 tiers before, 57% of seasons in the top 2 tiers afterwards. Now, the one caveat I'll draw to mind, the sharp-eyed will notice that if we look at tiers 5 and lower for the 15 tiers before and after, we actually see quite a big increase in the number of seasons in the lower 5 or lower. But what I would say is part of the reason for this is changes in the promotion and relegation system itself. If you go back to 1986, the beginning of the data, there was no guarantee that a team would get relegated at all. They would be subject to re-election, and frequently the usual outcome was that they were re-elected by the other teams in their tier, and so they weren't replaced. The automatic promotion relegation was only brought in around the end of the 80s, and initially it was just 1 team that went down, and it was only subsequently increased to 2 teams that went down. So in other words, there's been a lot more relegation out of the bottom 2 tiers since the advent of during my data sample period. And so in general, if we look at all teams, there's a lot more teams being relegated down to tier 5 or lower in more recent period. Okay, so overall, but the main conclusion here is the teams that build new stadiums do better in the seasons after their new stadium opened. And to do better, you have to have better players, and to have better players, you have to spend more money on them. And what the columns here shows are the rank of the teams. So the rank is between 1 and 92. There are 92 places from the top of tier 1 to the bottom of tier 4. And you can see that the average rank improves significantly and consistently after the building of a new stadium. And then you see the relative wages. They're actually spending less than the average in terms of relative wages before their stadium opens, and they're performing slightly below the average. But then, and they're particularly from seasons 6 onwards, their spending on players jumps significantly. So you can see that this effect is there, that they're spending more on players, and that's what is enabling them to achieve higher positions, higher ranks, and achieve promotion to higher divisions. And that's just a chart showing the same thing. The increase in it's the heavy dashed line that is the relative wages that you really want to focus on. Initially, they don't spend significantly more on wages, but over time, it increases quite dramatically relative to the level prior to opening the new stadium. So now what I want to do is look at this at the game level. And Actually, I think what I'm going to show you now is in many ways the most convincing evidence for capital skill complementarity. So what I've got here is, in my data set, there's about just over 71,000 games. And you can split this up. If you think of treated means you're playing in a new stadium. So you can think of games played between teams where the home team was treated and the away team was treated, the home team was treated and the away team was untreated, the home team was untreated and the away team was treated, and both teams were untreated. And that's the breakdown within the sample. So you can see here that there's a lot of obviously the majority of teams are untreated because only 32 teams get new stadiums. And the interesting comparison so hang on, let's put it here. So what we want to do is look at the change in attendance levels before and after opening a new stadium. So you've got the treated teams with a new stadium, and then those treated teams are playing teams in the same tier who don't have new stadiums. So you have matched opponents. So we can look at the attendance. So effectively, think about a classic English derby, Scunthorpe United versus Oldham Athletic. Scunthorpe United, of course, the first team to build a new stadium in this era. 1988, they built a new stadium. And Oldham Athletic, died in the wool, traditional conservatives, they've never built a new stadium. That's never going to happen. So they play each other typically in the fourth tier. If they get to when they get to play each other, that's where they're going to end up playing here. So you can imagine in a season when Scunthorpe has a new stadium and they play Oldham, you've got essentially the same game, by and large the same players. You've just got a difference in the stadium in which they're playing. And so we can identify the effect, the new stadium effect, by making this comparison with games where the home games of Scunthorpe versus the away games of Scunthorpe again in the same season. So we get a natural benchmark against which to evaluate the performance of the team. But at the same time, because we've got these different tiers, there are teams in the four tiers, in the four leagues, that are not playing the treated teams. You've got, so if Scunthorpe or Oldham are playing in tier 4, then you've got all the games of untreated teams in tiers 1, 2, and 3. And they have a level of attendance, and that's also some kind of a benchmark, a level to compare with. And so what I'm going to do is show you now a chart over time, before and after building a new stadium, comparing the teams with the new stadiums, their opponents in each season, and all of the teams that didn't build a new stadium. So what you can see here is the blue dots are the teams with new stadiums. And if you just focus on the blue dots for a moment, and you've got here the point where the stadium is open, the heavy vertical red line, and you can see the novelty effect, the honeymoon effect. You get this sudden jump in attendance when at teams which have built a new stadium. And you can see here, prior to that, the attendance, the blue dots are pretty horizontal, and you see this sudden jump. And it disappears after a few years. It sort of slowly declines, which is in line with the honeymoon effect that we observed in the North American literature. So that in that respect, it's similar. And then what you can see is the performance of their matched opponents. So these are the teams they're playing against in each season. And these orange dots are, again, if you look before the new stadium opens, it's again 20 seasons before the new stadium, they're pretty much on top of each other. So they're kind of similar levels of attendance. And then after the new stadium opens, because of the novelty effect, the matched opponents don't see a significant increase in attendance. They don't have the new stadium, it's their opponents. It's the treated teams that have the new stadium. So you're not seeing any jump immediately after the stadium opens. But then from season 5 onwards, you see a rise in the attendance at the opponents of teams playing that have new stadiums. That has to say something about the quality of play of the opponents. The opponents are getting better when you build a new stadium. And that's what the green dots enable you to do. The green dots is the average across all untreated teams, whatever tier they're playing in. And again, prior to the new stadium open, they're pretty much the same. They continue on this sort of horizontal path, but the orange dots, which are the ones to think about, the orange dots are significantly higher than the green dots after the new stadium open. So when you build a new stadium, you end up playing against better opponents. And that's what I would argue, that's evidence of the capital skill complementarity. The only way you can be playing against better opponents is to be in a better tier. You have to have been promoted on average in order to be playing against these better opponents. And that's so the logic here is that you build a new stadium, the marginal productivity of your players increases, that leads you to invest in more talent, that leads you to get promoted. That in itself will raise your marginal revenue product anyway, and then you will see this relative improvement in the level of play. And that's demonstrated by the level of improvement of your opponents. And for comparisons, this is the effect in Major League Baseball. So this is the same idea in Major League Baseball, only of course there's no promotion and relegation, so there are no, there's no way to find a higher level of opponents. So what you see here is, you see after the new stadium opened, the blue dots, yes, you see the honeymoon effect, you can see that very clearly, but there's no capital skill complementarity effect. The level of attendance of your opponents compared to all the untreated teams, because there are teams you never play against in Major League Baseball as well, it doesn't improve at all. Because effectively there's no opportunity. Essentially, the problem in baseball is there's no promotion opportunity. There's no opportunity to find better teams to play against. You're stuck with the teams that you've got. Now, what the new stadium does is enable relatively weak teams to increase their attendance and bring them into line with everybody else. So there is a benefit to the new stadium, but there is no there's no evidence of a capital skill complementarity effect, and that's consistent, of course, with the literature that I discussed earlier. So let me just read. I'm interested in your opinions. To me, this is actually kind of the most persuasive piece of evidence in the paper. Actually, this even though there's no regression here, this is simply means. It seems to me that these comparisons are very convincing demonstration, because it's the effect that it's the level of the opposition that you're playing against that improved, that demonstrates the significant effect. However, so I guess we always have to run some regressions. So, and what I wanted to do in the paper was think more carefully about identification and think about how this effect might be identified. And so I've drawn my direct acyclic graph here to illustrate how I think these causal links are working. So on the top left, you have the new stadium effect, and the vertical line going to attendance is the standard novelty effect. It increases attendance. Then I've also got this this dotted line to the marginal revenue product of labor. So which is obviously unobservable to us, but which I believe is a phenomenon which is consistent with the capital skill complementarity hypothesis. What that's going to lead to an increase in payroll expense. The belief that the marginal revenue product has increased should lead owners to invest more in payroll in order to secure the increased marginal returns which have been created by the new stadium. And that increased payroll will then observably lead to increased team success, which I think I've shown you. And that increased team success is then the horizontal line leading to increased attendance as well. So there's these two effects there's the direct effect of the new stadium to attendance, and then an indirect effect through the marginal productivity link, the capital skill complementarity, which is leading to increased payroll, increased team success, which is further enhancing attendance. And both of these are going to lead to increased revenue outcomes. And I want to distinguish here between the expectation of increased marginal revenue product, which is something about the future, and the revenue outcome, which is the result. And associated with this, I want to make 3 claims to establish these causal links. So I'd say there's no reverse causation from increased attendance to success. And that, I think, is supported by, there's this very nice COVID literature, which shows that the removing fans from the stadium had very little effect on team performance, or the number of fans in the stadium had very little effect. So if you had a small number of fans in the stadium, it still created the home advantage effect that you get when you have a full stadium, so that the size of the crowd in the stadium didn't seem to have any effect. And that's also supported by other research, which shows that the stadium crowd effect is as large when you're playing to smaller crowds as when you're playing to larger crowds. So that's sort of claim number 1. Claim number 2 is that there's no reverse causation going from increased success to increased payroll spending. Again, if you're familiar with my last Rose's presentation, where I argued quite strongly that if there were a link, if there were this reverse causation going on, then we would be able to measure it. We would be observable through surprises. If there's performance-related pay, then by definition, you will be rewarded for surprise, unexpected improvements in performance as much as you will be by expected improvements in performance. And I showed that in my paper that that's not the case. There's no evidence that surprises increases pay of players. And if that's the case, then they're not being paid for performance directly. They're not on a performance pay contract. They're really being, in general, they're being paid based on their observable ability. So there won't be reverse causation in that sense. And then the final thing is then going back to the revenue story, the outcome revenue shouldn't matter. So that's what in the causal inference literature you call a collider. And it's a collider, and actually the right thing to do with colliders is not include them in your regression. And so the argument here is that the investment that we're talking about in better players depends on your expectations about the future, and your expectations should be independent of what your revenue actually was. And what's going to happen here is not all teams that build a new stadium will get promoted and will play at a high level. Some will spend more money in the expectation of having a better team, and then will fail. That's a perfectly plausible outcome. And indeed, Scunthorpe United is an extremely good example of that failure. Because it doesn't always work out, right? So you don't want to look at revenue outcomes, because revenue outcomes could just be a response to good luck or bad luck. What's important is the expected increase in marginal revenue product. So I exclude revenue in the regression analysis from as a collider. So in terms of the regression method, the estimation method, I use this imputation method, which has been suggested by a number of authors, but most famously by Barusiak and his colleagues. This is a very simple and intuitive estimation method to deal with potential confounding effects of including observations against already treated units. The basic very simple idea. You basically run a regression on all units which have not yet been treated, so teams that were going to build a stadium but have not yet built it, and all teams that are never treated, so the teams that never built the stadium. So you take that subsample and you run your regression, and then you generate you fit the regression for the treated sample, the subset that was not included in the regression, you get the fitted values, and then you take the difference between the outcome, the actual outcome, and the fitted values, and that gives you your treatment effect. I think it's a wonderfully intuitive, simple idea for dealing with this. It has lots of advantages. You should look, if you haven't looked at this paper, you should look at it. It now, it's actually sort of the third iteration. I think it's already got 1,000 Google Scholar citations, and it's still a working paper. It's not the only approach that people are using to look at this, but it is I think it is a very useful method. So this one of the benefits of this is it gives, because one of the issues here is heterogeneity. Obviously we've got teams in 4 different tiers, so there's lots of differences between them. It does allow for unrestricted heterogeneity. Although also what I will say is, in order to measure the attendance effects, I'm going to estimate attendance by tier. I'm going to look at attendance effects by tiers. So I'm going to run two regressions. One regression of attendance to identify the novelty effect, and the other a payroll regression to look at the capital skill complementarity. So here's the attendance regression results, and what you can see here, so I've got for the 4 tiers, you can see there are quite a lot of differences here. So there's one common feature, which is there is a novelty effect. In each tier, when you open the new stadium, you get a significant rise in attendance. The differences are the effects, and again, none of this is terribly surprising. The effects are much larger in the higher tiers, largest in the top tier, fairly significant in the second tier, and fairly short-lived in tiers 3 and 4. Actually, there's not much difference between tiers 3 and 4 in the data. And so one way to think about this is, if you were stuck in these tiers, if you were stuck in tier 4 forever or tier 3 forever, this would give you serious pause about building a new stadium, right? But bear in mind, if you then get from tier 3 to tier 2, you then enjoy the attendance benefits of being in tier 2. So in that sense, that's the mobility between the tiers. It's what's driving the incentive to invest in the lower tiers, because you can get the kinds of effects that you observe in tier 2 and tier 1 from a new stadium. Notice that again, in tiers 3 and 4, the novelty effect disappears essentially within 3 or 4 seasons. So it's very short-lived. But remember also, relatively few of those teams in tier 3 and 4 that build new stadiums are still in tiers 3 and 4, or in the same tier at least, when after 3 or 4 seasons they're moving up, and you can see a much longer-lived effect. And particularly noticeable in tier 2, the effect seems very long-lived, right? So you can see even 11, 12, 13, 14 seasons after building a new stadium, you're still observing a positive attendance effect. And that could well be picking up these teams that have been promoted and are now playing at a higher level. So that's the novelty effect, but basically the story is it looks the same. And here is the payroll regression effect. And what you can see here is that the payroll after a few seasons increases significantly. So that the effect of building a new stadium is to raise payroll spending really after 5 seasons after opening the new stadium, and remains consistently significant up until at least 15 seasons after the opening of the new stadium. All right, so that's basically it. So my conclusion is that the capital skill complementarity hypothesis suggests that new stadiums should increase the marginal product of skilled athletes. The US data finds no support and could be explained by fan preferences or labor market restraints. But the new stadiums in English soccer are associated with increased attendance at the games, higher payrolls, and more frequent participation in higher league tiers. so that the English data is indeed consistent with the capital skill complementarity. And again, I would argue that this all really stems from the role played by the promotion and relegation system, which is present in the soccer world but absent in the normal professional sports. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Stefan. Very, very interesting talk. One thing I'll just say to add a bit of information to your talk about promotion and relegation from the 4th to 5th tier. Being the keen Scunthorpe fan as you are, you'll know that has changed over the years. It began actually in 86, 87 was the first season when there was promotion relegation. So it starts right at the beginning of your sample. But it only increases to 2 teams in 2003. So it does increase, as you say, but it is increased. And also it's worth saying that a number of those early seasons, the team trying to get promotion from the conference didn't have a stadium of sufficient quality to get them, to allow them to get into the Football League. So there was no relegation because of that. So that's a bit of information I've learned since yours and my teams have been relegated out of the Football League. Daniele had his hand up right at the end of the talk, so I'm going to go to Daniele first, and then Alex has got his hand up as well. So Daniele first.
Hi, Stefan. Very interesting presentation. Actually, I'm going to start with a technical question on, I think, the second to last slide, or the third to last, on the event study on attendance. Yeah, this one. So you said something about you see less of a bump in tier 3 and tier 4, but is this conditioning on the current tier in which the teams play? Because I thought that maybe you wanted to do it at, what the tier was at the time that I was playing. So if I'm in tier 3, I build a new stadium and then I'm promoted to tier 2 and 1, then attendance will presumably go up. But I would put that as, the group is, built a new stadium when I was in tier 3. And then I think that's part of the story that you want to capture, that, the attendance is going up for, because, quality improves and you make it to the higher tier. Or maybe I didn't quite understand these graphs.
Yeah, no, it's an interesting point. I think so. The idea, so in each of these, for each of these tables, it's based on a regression, which is a subset of teams that only play in that tier.
Right.
So if you build a new stadium in tier 3, and then 5 or 6 years later you're promoted to tier 2, you're not included in this regression. So this is, if you like, the attendance, the novelty effect contingent on the tier, contingent only on being in this particular tier. And again, the idea is that you get a novelty effect in the lower tiers, but that effect is really not very great if you stay in that tier. It's only really when you get out of that tier that you can see a significant effect. So
you could do it both ways, I think. Like, so what you're showing here is basically, you could say it's just capturing the novelty effect, and then that sort of capital skill complementarity would be
right, because that's really here in this regression. The payroll, they're spending more, which is the natural response to an increase in marginal productivity, skilled labor. And this, of course, this is across all tiers, right? So, and this, bear in mind, the payroll is, we only have the payroll data annually, so we can't do it at the game level. These tables are at the game level, and this regression is at the season level.
Thank you.
Great, thanks, Daniele. So Alex next. No, hang on. Is that right, Alex?
I just by mistake, but if I may, so thank you, Stefan. You have this figure when everything goes back like 15 years after they build the stadium. So I missed. So there was one figure when everything like converges back to the same story as it before the. And my
About
question, so everything came back to this. So it went up after the you build the stadium. There were several. Can you go one back or several back? Okay, so 24 maybe. No, not 24. Yeah. This one. Yeah. So I see like what happened there after like 13 years.
Well, so bear in mind that look at 15 years. They're still significantly, their rank is still significantly higher than it was before building the new stadium. But you know, this is sort of some kind of Icarus effect, I expect. They flew too close to the sun and then they fell down again. So they're doing within this framework. You do better. But obviously, there's a lot of noise as well. You get promoted, you get relegated. That can happen. And you know, this how long-lived this effect might be, this capital skill complementarity effect, is an interesting question. I mean, after a certain number of years, you know, obviously after 15 years, the stadium is not really that new anymore. So this capital skill complementarity effect might start to fade.
But the fall is like very sharp, I would say. I would expect more smooth fall.
The important point is surely that it's still significantly, even after the fall, it's significantly above the level that it was at. So look at the wages, the dashed line. Look at the dashed line of wages. The variation is not great. Right? So they're spending about the same. So there's an awful lot of randomness in team performance, and so you can have an expensive team and get relegated, or you can have a very low cost team and get promoted. I mean,
but I think it's a very interesting. I think it's a very interesting point there. This fall, maybe worth to investigate what is happening. I think because you know, if you build the stadium and then maybe 12 years later you have to do something else based on this figure.
Well, if Alex, you're telling me you're entirely persuaded by the argument of this, but now we want to progress to another paper to explain this, then I'm happy. But I'm just trying to get persuaded the capital skill complementarity hypothesis. Really, that's the number one on my agenda.
Or maybe it's a simple thing that nothing lasts forever, right? At some point, it just ends.
Sadly. Which is more relevant to some of us here than others, actually. But there you go.
Okay, so it turned out that I mistakenly thought the hand with Alex, but it's actually Richard's hand. So Richard, do you want to ask your question?
Hi, thanks, James. Yeah, hi, Stefan. Thanks for the paper, very interesting. I think it's actually interesting in terms of justifying new stadiums if you're effectively introducing a new payback on the hypothesis. But what I was interested in, the way you've explained it, as I understand it, is you have a line of causation running from successful, so building new stadium to successful team. But you use the word complementarity and you invoke the theory of complementarity, which to me implies no causation. It's a neutral term. You could go either way, and you have imposed on that a line of causation, which you showed in your diagram. I suspect that there's a confounding variable which is heavily influencing your diagram, and I think that's owner investment. And I think what's happening is that owners come into clubs, they want to put money into the club, they want to put money into the team, they realise the stadium's a mess, they probably invest in the training ground as well, which I suspect is also a variable which you'd find statistically significant. And so your owner investment is actually driving both components here, and there's probably no link at all actually between the two variables which you've linked causality wise. So I suspect that's an issue. I have a couple of other little points though that I mentioned. What your claim one about the crowd size having no effect as shown in COVID is I think that's just debatable. I think there's quite strong evidence to suggest that away teams did a lot better when there was no crowd. I think there was an influence in the results for sure. And also, I think in response to one of the questions where somebody was looking at the difference between the US and the UK experience, or the English experience, they asked about were the stadiums privately owned or not. The answer is actually that some of them are privately owned. I mean, most notably things like Manchester City, for example, which is owned by Manchester City Council and leased to the football club. West Ham United, which is leased. I mean, there are plenty of examples of leased stadiums. So it's not strictly true to say that they're all privately owned. They're all owned by the football clubs. It's a minor point. I was also curiously interested, to ask one more, how you dealt with expansions, because there have been some significant expansions to stadiums, whether they do on one side of the ground or whatever. I mean, Manchester United added 8,000 seats in 2006, for example. Fulham, more recently, outside your data set 2019, knocked down the whole of the Riverside stand and built a whole new stand. Now, do you consider that to be a new stadium? Because some of the effects would be the same. Do you actually have to have a move in location to get your effect, or can you do it on the same site? I think that might expand your set of examples if you start to think about those as well. So a few points in there.
Yeah, no, thank you, Richard, and they're all very good points. So I think on the public-private here, you can. What I said was I thought about a quarter of them were publicly funded, and I think that's roughly what you can see here in this table. So this is the list of the 32. Scunthorpe United was publicly funded, and then Northampton, Hull, as you said, Manchester City, Swansea City, Coventry City, Doncaster Rovers, Colchester United, and as you mentioned, West Ham. So I mean, I think it's about a quarter, and there are a couple of joint funding, and it's always a little bit difficult with funding. I mean, I don't think there's ever a case where the local government has not in some way provided a resource to the new stadium. I mean, there's always something that they're doing. So in some sense, there's always a bit of public funding going in. How much? But essentially, this is somewhat different from the American story, where the percentage of the share of public funding tends to be much larger. So there's a little bit of a difference. I mean, I don't think it matters particularly for my story, but I think it is a very interesting question. And I think, one of the things I wanted to draw attention to with this paper right back at the beginning, if I go back 8 years when I first started doing this, one of the points about this is that people ignore the fact of how much investment in new stadiums there's been in the world of soccer in recent years. All of this literature is North American, which seems to be nuts, because actually we're doing a lot of it as well. So we ought to focus and research on it, in my view. I think the point you raised about about stadium investment. If we talk about stadium investment, 100% of them have spent money on stadium renovations in this period. And as you say, I mean, some of them are tantamount to building a new stadium. So there is a little bit of a gray area here, right? So I think it's problematic. So one of the things is, if I want to identify sort of causal effects, I need to draw a line somewhere. I have to have some untreated clubs. And so what this is in some sense, this is relative to the upgrades that people have done. I think there could be an argument to say, as you said, to think about whether there are some clubs whose renovations are so extensive they should be considered a new stadium. However, I would also say, there is a very clear difference. There is a very clear novelty effect identified with these new stadiums specifically. And if it were the case that all what the other clubs were doing were equivalent in that sense, you wouldn't necessarily see these effects. So, but I think it's a good point, and I think it's definitely worth thinking about. Going back to the complementarity effect, you're quite right. I mean, the effect here that's described in the literature is an effect is basically a consequence of the production function. So it's basically inherent in the structure of the production function that this complementarity can exist. And that doesn't mean to say that anybody's actually going to pay any attention to it. It's just there. However, for this complementarity to be revealed, somebody does have to act on it. So the owner, the investor, the firm, or whoever you think the agent is, has to then act on this complementarity to invest more in skilled labor in order to drive up the wages and employment of skilled labor at the same time. So there has to be some action in order to reveal this complementarity. It could be that it exists, but it's just not acted upon, which I think is the position in the North American literature, or somebody acts upon it, the owner, investor, whoever, in order to reveal it through increased spending on players and so on. And that's what I'm saying. That's what I'm describing. There's this latent mechanism that is unobservable but inherent in the production function, which is then revealed to us by the actions of the owners, who are basically following the logic of the inherent complementarity. So that's the way I view it. So and crowd size effects. Yeah, well, we'll have to argue about that another time. But I think you're right. I mean, as with all such things, I mean, there's a case, well, but it could be argued both ways. My reading of the literature was that it wasn't that this was consistent with my claim, but I grant you, it's quite likely that other people could read the literature differently. But thanks, those are great comments, Richard.
Great, thanks, Richard. Jeremy had his hand up momentarily. It went down. It's back up again. So Jeremy, go ahead.
Yeah, no, thank you. So quick question. I'm just thinking about all of this. I get the sense that the way we're telling the story is that the reason to invest or build a new stadium, you want to get that increased benefit of the new stadium that comes from being at a higher level. Hence, we're going to invest in talent and labor so that we can experience that promotion, right? So the kind of the counterfactual or the counter thought I had was, well, what would happen if instead of investing in capital at all, you use that same investment and just invested in labor, right? So you just invest in payroll and have those same theoretical promotional effects. Would we still see, like, is it optimal to even think about it in the context of investing in capital in order to see those gains in attendance, when theoretically is a lot of the gains driven by the promotion piece to it? Because there's obviously a honeymoon effect, right? But is the cost of getting that increase in honeymoon effects from jumping levels worth it relative to what you could get investing in labor in the same context? I don't know if I phrased that well at all, but I hope that kind of expressed what I was thinking.
No, thanks, Jeremy. That is a great question, and I think that's a really good thing to think about. I mean, I mean, we should all pause and think about how we think these mechanisms are. And that's one of the things I'm trying to get across, is actually thinking through the causal logic of this. And I think so. I'm not sure it's central to my paper, but I think the argument would go something like this. Yes, you could invest directly in the players and not build a new stadium, and that would be and that's clearly what teams do all the time, and that they make that investment, and it will get you promoted to a higher level, and that's part of the system. I think the issue is that, again, if you're a Scunthorpe United, you need to think about the teams that are not very good at the bottom of the system. What happens if they make that investment? The problem is going to be that because the capital stock they're using, the stadium, is not great, you will struggle to attract fans, and therefore the route to promotion goes through the new stadium itself. So that I think is the argument. I don't think it's central to my paper, because my paper is just saying, well, if you do, then there is this capital skill complementarity. You're saying, well, think about now a general equilibrium model. How do we decide who's choosing to build new stadiums and who's not? Then and then you need to think about the trade-off. Is it cheaper just to buy the players, or is it cheaper to build a new stadium and go through that route? I think One of the things I was thinking about in this is, well, who is it who gets to build new stadiums and why? And one of the things is, I was having a student do this, and they never finished the job, but I asked them to go through newspaper clippings to see which clubs were thinking about building a new stadium. Never mind whether they did, but in just over time, how many newspaper sites can you find to, again, Oldham Athletic thinking about building a new stadium? You know,
We did, yeah.
all the time, right, James? It's in the discussion all the time. It strikes me that all clubs at all times want to build a new stadium, which I think is, again, Jeremy, I think it goes to your point, which I think is really interesting. How is that true? Why are they capital constrained? What is the problem, and why is it that they always desiring to build a new stadium? And I think that's an interesting paper in its own right. And maybe if I can get a student to do this, or somebody else can get a student to go trawl through the press, I think it would be just interesting to document that fact. It strikes me all clubs at all times would like a new stadium.
I think sometimes it's not necessarily capital constraint, but it's other types of constraints, right? It's local authority not allowing the land for that particular purpose, things like that.
Yeah, a great point. Actually, yeah, no, that is true. And also fan resistance, right? So a lot of new stadium plans involve relocation, and a lot of fans don't like relocation, and therefore that can be an obstacle as well. And Manchester United have a terrible problem, right? I mean, they desperately need a new stadium, and they can't build it anywhere else than Old Trafford. And so they have to build a new stadium, they will have to demolish the existing stadium and build another stadium right next door on the same footprint, whilst continuing to play in the Premier League. And probably again, football fans are going to know the history of this. In the Manchester United stadium was bombed during the war, and Manchester City actually let them play in their stadium for a few seasons after the war, whilst they rebuilt Old Trafford. And I don't think that's happening again now, which would be a good solution for Manchester United. Manchester City. Good.
Just out of interest, before get on, Stefan, does that question? I mean, does the point that Jeremy was making? Does it mean that it's possible you might overstate the effect of the new stadium, because in the years up to the new stadium opening, resources have been diverted from the team to the stadium, such that the team goes down, stadium's open in the low division, and then lo and behold, you see, this great positive effect. And I guess your event study ought to be able to, get at that possibility.
Yeah, I mean, again, if you look at this table here, again, the solid line is the average league performance. I don't think there's any evidence that they're doing any worse before they open the new stadium. I mean, but I mean, you're right. And from an economic perspective, well, the resources don't just come from heaven, right? So there's some substitution here as well that must be going on. So you think that there is, but again, it's not evidence in data, neither in terms of the wage spending, nor in terms of the actual league position achieved. So again, for this paper, I don't worry about it, but I think you raise an interesting question. I think, where are the resources coming from? I suppose the other alternative is to say, well, these are investments, and so there's no reason to think you have to substitute past performance for future performance. The investments will in some sense pay for themselves because of the increased demand. So maybe that's the answer.
Okay, get on.
Yeah, hi Stefan, thank you for this. I recall some of the data. I would argue to that extent is I don't think there are examples of clubs that wanted to build a new stadium, didn't end up building it, and then suddenly spent millions on new players because they're like, oh, well, then we're not building a new stadium. So that's one counter argument that I think I would imagine. It seems like it's two different resources or sources being used. That I know Arsenal is the example people think of. They're like, oh, before they built the new stadium, they weren't buying new players. Now they are. Was it that? I don't imagine you would see too much of an effect that if the clubs did not build a new stadium, they said, oh, great, now we have £200 million in instead to buy players. And then again, also I'd ask where financial fair play comes into this. where some clubs adhere to and others don't, but that's a different question. But that would suggest, therefore, if I'm building a new stadium, I can't spend on transfers, or is that the case or not?
Oh, thanks, Gidon. Great questions. And yes, the origin of this paper goes back to work that Gidon and I were doing several years ago. So Gidon has a hand in this whole thing, one way or the other. I think in terms of the plans for the clubs, I think the way to settle this would be, I think, again, to do the newspaper search, and then figure out and develop some kind of probability model of the probability of building a new stadium. And once you generate that probability, then you could look at whether how that probability interacts with actual wage spending. So I think that's a great question. Again, it's a great it'd be a great subject for a PhD student to look at, in my view. Just saying. But I haven't done that, but I'm not, and I'm honestly not sure which way it would go. I think that's worth looking at. In terms of financial fair play, a good question. You notice that I sort of hedged my bets a little bit about labour market restraints, precisely because there have been some regulations brought in recent years. Most of my data period, there are really essentially no restraints, but there are some limited restraints. However, one thing that would happen is in financial fair play, stadium spending would be excluded. So you could build a new stadium, and that would not count against your team payroll spending. But also bear in mind that, well, it's complicated because the vast majority of clubs in my sample would not be affected at all by financial fair play, because it only applies to teams that are participating in European competition, and most of the clubs are not. And also, then there are restrictive mechanisms that were adopted by the lower divisions, by the other divisions. I mean, the Premier League has their own version of it, and it gets very complicated. And it could, again, I think my point would be, in my data set, it's not really going to play a very important role, because it only really affects the very end of the data set. And by that time, most of the clubs planning in relation to building new stadiums had already been completed.
I think that might be interesting in terms of the questions of the public and the private funded ones, is that certain clubs in the Premier League, for instance, had the benefit of actually playing in a primarily publicly financed stadium. So they didn't even need to pay initially those millions of pounds towards the stadium, and could spend on other things, hypothetically.
Well, you and I need to get together, Gidon, just to talk about how we repurpose the draft paper that we wrote many years ago. So maybe that's one route that we could take. So let's have a conversation about that soon.
I'm done.
Thanks, Gidon. Richard, time for one more question, I think, before we wrap up. So go ahead, Richard.
You're very kind. Thank you, James. I just wanted to follow up on the point you made, actually, James. In the specific case of Arsenal, they invested, or made the decision to invest in their new stadium before anybody in football had ever heard of Abramovich, and they clearly intended, with FFP in mind, to expand their capability to invest in players by investing in a stadium, which would increase their revenue and therefore allow them to invest in the players. And that was the logic. When Abramovich appeared on the scene, and a bit later the Man City effects, but it was originally Abramovich and Chelsea, they realised they weren't going to achieve that. And in fact, what happened, the quality of the team was allowed to atrophy remarkably quickly from 2004, when they were invincible, to a period of just total decline for many years. I mean, pretty much 20 years afterwards. So they got the new stadium. They couldn't fill it, actually. They did initially, as you say, with a honeymoon blip, but very soon afterwards they couldn't fill the stadium, and the number of the waiting list just collapsed for season tickets. So there are cases where events overtook, we say, that the logic that would have been consistent with your hypothesis, Stefan, but events intervened. I also think there are cases where successful teams then induce the owners to then invest in the stadium, because they think, hey, we're onto a good thing here, let's build a stadium. And it's hard to say what came first, because as you say, virtually everybody is thinking about building a new stadium. But I mean, most recent one that comes to mind is Nottingham Forest, who obviously getting promoted, suddenly now are very keen on their planning application, which they got approved last September after they got promoted. So the chicken and the egg have come the other way around in that case, and I suspect there are other examples like that. It's just off the top of my head.
Yeah, no, I mean, like I say, I mean, I think teams want to build a new stadium all the time, and I think it's not that they suddenly think about building a new stadium when they're promoted. It's that they think that they have more potential leverage to get through the planning process when they get promoted. But again, I draw your attention to the fundamental point of more than half of the new stadiums were built by teams that were playing in the third and fourth tiers, not by teams in the top tiers.
Okay, well, we've hit 4 p.m. So thank you very much, Stefan. Thank you, everyone, for contributions. Really interesting talk on the capital skill complementarity. We now take a 2-week break because next week a number of folk will be in Cork, and I wish you all a fantastic time in Cork. Then the following week there's no talk because I'm on holiday that week, and we return on September the 8th with Timothy Schreier presenting Evaluating the Effects of Diverse Strategies on Team Performance in the Face of Shocks. Final reminder, if you do want to present November or December, please get in touch. And otherwise, wish you a great weekend and a fantastic couple of weeks. Thank you very much.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you.
Thanks.